The air in the Silver Creek Bank was thick with the scent of stale paper-metal coin and the quiet desperation that clung to the town like dust. It was a silence born of fear, a fragile thing that shattered when the doors flew open, and a man stumbled in his face, a mask of coal dust and despair. He was young, barely out of his teens, with eyes that held the frantic, hunted look of a cornered animal. In his trembling hand, a rusty prospector's pistol was aimed squarely at the chest of the bank teller, a man whose spectacles had slid to the tip of his nose in terror. "The payroll," the young miner rasped, his voice cracking. "Bradley's payroll. I want my share." Outside, the midday sun bleached the very color from the sky, leaving a hazy white canvas stretched over the Montana territory. A few townsfolk froze on the boardwalk, their daily routines arrested by the raw drama unfolding behind the bank's plate-glass window. Among them was Rebecca Mitchell, her hand clutching a small worn leather pouch. She had come to withdraw the last of the meager funds Daniel had left, a sum that would barely feed her children for another week. Her heart hammered against her ribs, not just for the teller, but for the raw, familiar anguish in the young miner's voice. She had seen that look in the eyes of other men, fired from Mason Bradley's mine men, whose lives were broken on the anvil of one man's greed. The teller, a man named Henderson, raised his hands slowly. "Now, son," he began, his voice a reedy quaver. "Let's not do anything hasty. The payroll isn't here. It's kept at the mine office until Friday." "Liar!" the miner shrieked, spittle flying from his lips. He lunged across the counter, grabbing Henderson by his starched collar and pressing the pistol to his temple. "You think I'm a fool? Bradley fired me yesterday. Me and a dozen others. Said we were redundant. My wife's sick. My baby needs medicine. I worked 2 weeks for that pay, and I'm not leaving without it." The standoff tightened, a knot of impending violence. Sheriff Wyatt was nowhere to be seen, likely enjoying a midday meal at the saloon, his services rendered to Bradley, not the town. It was then that a shadow fell across the bank's doorway. A man stepped inside, moving with a quiet economy that seemed to absorb the frantic energy in the room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his features carved from the hard Montana landscape. A scar, a pale silver line, ran from his left temple down his cheek, pulling slightly at the corner of a firm mouth. It was a face that spoke of past battles, yet his eyes, a startling gray-green, held no malice, only a profound and unsettling calm. He wore the simple, durable clothes of a rancher, with a gun belt slung low on his hips, though his hand rested nowhere near the holstered pistol. "The boy's telling the truth." The stranger said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an authority that made both the miner and the teller turn to look. "Henderson doesn't have the payroll. But I have a proposition for you." The miner's pistol wavered, his wild eyes fixing on the newcomer. "Stay back. I ain't afraid to use this." The stranger took another slow step into the room, his hands held open and away from his body. "I can see that. I can also see you're a man who's been pushed too far. My name is Gabriel Hayes. I have a ranch a few hours from here. I need good men, hard workers. I'm offering you a job. Fair wages, a roof for your family, and medical care for your wife." The miner stared, his mind struggling to process an offer of help in a town that offered only condemnation. Why, he choked out, "Why would you help me?" "Because I've seen what men like Bradley do to good people." Gabriel set his gaze unwavering. "And because no man should be so desperate, he feels this is his only choice. Let Mr. Henderson go. Walk out of here with me. Your troubles aren't over, but they can have a new beginning." The tension in the room shifted. The raw violence began to recede, replaced by a fragile, burgeoning hope. The miner's grip on the teller loosened. His pistol hand began to tremble, not with rage, but with the crushing weight of his decision. The sudden movement of the crowd outside, drawn by the commotion, startled him. He flinched, and as Rebecca instinctively took a step back, her worn pouch slipped from her grasp. It fell to the dusty floorboards, with a soft thud, the clasp springing open. A small silver locket rolled out, coming to a stop near Gabriel Hayes's boot. Inside the bank, the young miner finally broke. A sob tore from his throat, and the pistol clattered to the floor. He collapsed against the counter, his shoulders shaking. Henderson, released from the immediate threat, scrambled back, gasping for air. Gabriel didn't move toward the defeated miner. Instead, he bent down, his movements deliberate, and picked up the silver locket. He held it in his calloused palm for a moment, before looking toward the doorway, his eyes finding Rebecca's. He stepped outside the commotion of the crowd, parting around him. He walked directly to her, the locket held out in his open hand. "I believe this is yours, ma'am." Rebecca stared at the locket, its silver surface cool against the heat of the day. Inside, behind tiny glass panes, were the miniature portraits of her children, Emma and Joshua, their faces frozen in a moment of innocence that felt a lifetime away. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough with work, but surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Their eyes met for a brief, charged moment. In his, she saw not pity, but a quiet, profound understanding. It was as if this stranger, in this single chaotic moment, had seen the full scope of her own quiet desperation. Before either could say more, Sheriff Wyatt arrived, his face flushed with irritation at having his lunch interrupted. He shoved his way through the crowd, his gaze falling on Gabriel with open suspicion, before he entered the bank to deal with the now sobbing miner. The spell was broken. Rebecca clutched the locket and melted back into the crowd, her heart still racing. She didn't know who the stranger was, but his act of calm intervention, of offering a lifeline instead of a bullet, was so contrary to the brutal calculus of Silver Creek that it felt like a miracle. She glanced back once more, but he was already gone, leaving behind only the hushed whispers of the townsfolk and the lingering question of who Gabriel Hayes was, and why he had chosen to stand against the tide of Mason Bradley's cruelty. 3 days later, the sun pressed down on the small cemetery at the edge of town, a merciless eye in a bleached sky. The heat shimmered off the weathered gravestones, warping the air above the freshly turned earth of Daniel Mitchell's grave. Rebecca stood rigid at its edge, the black fabric of her dress absorbing the heat, her face a pale mask of grief beneath her veil. Beside her, 6-year-old Emma clung to her skirt, while 4-year-old Joshua stood unnaturally still, his small face a frozen portrait of confusion. The preacher's final prayer hung in the air, a thin thread of solace in the profound silence. As the mourners began to disperse, offering whispered condolences that blurred into a meaningless hum, a shadow fell across the grave. Mason Bradley stood before her, his expensive black suit straining against his corpulent frame. His gray-streaked hair was slicked back, and his eyes, cold as the silver ore that had made him rich, assessed Rebecca with a calculated indifference that was more insulting than open contempt. "Mrs. Mitchell." He began, his voice a smooth veneer of false gentility that carried to the remaining mourners. "A regrettable business, this accident. However, life, much like commerce, must continue." He cleared his throat, a sound of self-importance. "I will require you to vacate the company house within the week. There is a new foreman arriving who will require the accommodation." Rebecca's head snapped up. Through the thin black veil, her blue eyes widened in disbelief. "A week, my husband is barely in the ground." Bradley's mouth twitched with impatience. "Your husband's employment with the mine, and thus his claim to its perquisites, concluded with his unfortunate demise, Mrs. Mitchell. The house is company property. Daniel gave 10 years of his life to your mine." Rebecca said, her voice strengthening despite the hollow ache in her chest. The words felt like stones in her mouth. Surely you can grant his family a little time. The terms were explicitly clear in his contract. Bradley interrupted his tone, suggesting she was a slow-witted child. No special considerations can be made. Business, as I've said, is business. A few of the lingering miners' men who had worked alongside Daniel shifted uncomfortably, their faces weathered, and their expressions guarded. None dared to speak. Their silence was a testament to the suffocating power Bradley held over every soul in Silver Creek. "Where are we supposed to go?" Rebecca asked, her hand instinctively moving to rest on Joshua's small, still shoulder. Bradley adjusted his silk tie with manicured fingers, a small, preening gesture. "That is hardly my concern, Mrs. Mitchell. Perhaps if your husband hadn't been so vocal about his ridiculous notions of workers' rights and fair compensation, he might have advanced to a position that would have better provided for you." His voice lowered, taking on a conspiratorial, venomous edge. Some might even say his agitation contributed to the unfortunate circumstances of his death. The insinuation hung in the hot, still air, sharp as a shard of glass. A white-hot fury, sudden and blinding, surged through Rebecca. Before she could think, her hand lashed out. The sound of her palm striking Bradley's fleshy cheek was a sharp crack that silenced every whisper in the cemetery. Bradley's hand flew to his face, his eyes bulging with shock and rage. "How dare you?" he sputtered, his carefully constructed facade crumbling. "How dare you?" Rebecca countered, her voice trembling but clear as a bell. "Slander my husband at his own grave." Bradley's face darkened to a dangerous shade of purple. "You will regret that, Mrs. Mitchell. You have until sundown. Not a week. Sundown. After that, I will have Sheriff Wyatt personally escort you and your brats from company property." He turned to the stunned onlookers, his voice booming. "Let this be a lesson. In Silver Creek, you show respect to your betters." As Bradley stormed away, the full weight of her action crashed down upon her. She had condemned her children to the street. Emma pressed closer, trembling. "Mama, where will we go?" Rebecca knelt, gathering both children into her arms, forcing a calm she did not feel into her voice. "Don't you worry, my loves. We'll find a place." She looked into their trusting faces, a silent, desperate prayer forming in her heart that her words were not a lie. By dusk, they were outcasts. Their meager possessions, a trunk of clothes, a box of kitchenware, and Daniel's worn books, were piled in a small cart, borrowed from a sympathetic but fearful church caretaker. They spent the night in the church vestibule, but by the third day, even Reverend Thompson's charity was strained by Bradley's open disapproval. Rebecca sat on the church steps, watching Emma and Joshua scavenge for scraps behind the saloon. The sight burned into her like a brand. A long shadow fell over them. Sheriff Wyatt approached his lean frame, silhouetted against the setting sun, his badge gleaming. "Mrs. Mitchell," he drawled, hooking his thumbs in his belt. "Been receiving complaints. Vagrancy. Theft." "We've stolen nothing," Rebecca said sharply, rising to stand between him and her children. "There's also the matter of proper care." Wyatt continued, his eyes cold and flat. "A woman alone, no means of support. The town council is concerned." A cold fear gripped Rebecca's spine. "There's a home for orphans over in Helena. They take in children whose parents can't provide. Might be the best place for them." "My children are not orphans," Rebecca's voice turned to ice. Wyatt chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "From where I'm standing, you can't put a roof over their heads. That's neglect in the eyes of the law." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low threat. "Find a proper situation by the end of the week, or I'll be forced to take action. For their welfare, of course." As he sauntered away, panic seized her. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Emma's small voice broke through her terror. "Mama, are they going to take us away?" Rebecca knelt, gathering her children close, their small bodies trembling against hers. "No, my loves," she vowed, her voice fierce. "I will never let that happen. Never." But even as she made the promise, she had no idea how she would keep it. It was then that she saw him crossing the dusty street with deliberate, unhurried steps. It was the stranger from the bank, Gabriel Hayes. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gray-green eyes taking in their desperate situation. "Ma'am," he said, his voice the same low, steady tone she remembered. "I couldn't help but overhear your predicament with the sheriff." Rebecca's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And you are?" "Gabriel Hayes. I have a ranch outside of town." He glanced at the children, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "I need someone to help with the household, cooking, some medical knowledge. The position comes with room and board. For all of you." "I don't accept charity, Mr. Hayes," she said, her pride a flimsy shield against her desperation. A hint of respect flickered in his eyes. "It's not charity, it's employment. I have a need. You have a need. It's a simple arrangement." Why would a stranger offer help? She pressed the question, echoing the harsh lessons Silver Creek had taught her. People here don't do that without a price. His gaze shifted briefly toward the sheriff, who watched them from across the street. "The price is hard work. I have a ranch that needs a skilled hand. I saw you at the funeral. I saw what Bradley did." He met her eyes again, his gaze direct and honest. "I'm not him." The simple declaration resonated with a truth she desperately wanted to believe. Emma tugged at her skirt. "Please, Mama, I don't want the sheriff to take us away." Rebecca looked down at her daughter's pleading face, and then at Joshua's silent, fearful one. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Daniel would have wanted her to protect the children, no matter the cost. "When would we leave?" she asked, the words tasting of surrender and hope. Now Gabriel replied without hesitation, "I have a wagon ready. We can be well on our way before full dark." Rebecca took a deep, shuddering breath. "Very well, Mr. Hayes. We accept your offer." As he walked away to bring the wagon around, she knelt before her children. "We're going to stay at Mr. Hayes's ranch for a little while," she said, forcing a bright tone. "It will be an adventure." "Is he a good man?" Mama Emma whispered, her eyes wide. Rebecca watched Gabriel's retreating form, a silhouette of quiet strength against the dying light. "I don't know, darling," she answered honestly. "But right now, he's our only chance." Dust, fine as powdered rust, rose in plumes with every turn of the wagon wheels. The trail stretched ahead, a pale scar on an unforgiving landscape, as they traveled away from Silver Creek and into the gathering darkness. Silence settled between them, heavy and profound, broken only by the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the soft clip-clop of the horse's hooves. Rebecca sat stiffly on the driver's bench beside Gabriel, her children huddled among their few possessions in the back. She studied his profile in the fading light. The scar was a testament to violence, yet his hands on the reins were steady and gentle. He was a man of contradictions, and that unnerved her. "How far is your ranch?" she asked, the silence becoming unbearable. "About a 4-hour ride," he replied, his voice a low rumble. "We call it Willow Creek." He glanced at her briefly. "You have experience with more than just basic nursing, I hear." "From the war." "I served in field hospitals," she confirmed cautiously. "But that was a long time ago." "Skills like that don't fade," he said, a statement of fact, not flattery. "They'll be useful." His reticence was a wall she couldn't seem to breach. She looked back at her children. Emma had finally dozed off, her head resting on a bundled blanket. Joshua was awake, his dark eyes reflecting the starlight as he stared up at the vast, silent sky. "Your boy doesn't speak," Gabriel observed quietly, not as a question, but as a simple statement. Rebecca stiffened. "He hasn't. Not since his father died." Gabriel nodded as if this explanation was entirely sufficient. The mind protects itself how it can. Before she could respond, he pulled sharply on the reins, bringing the wagon to a halt. His body had gone taut. "What is it?" Rebecca whispered, alarm rising in her throat. He raised a hand for silence, his eyes scanning the darkness. With a fluid, practiced movement, he reached beneath the seat and withdrew a rifle. "Stay here," he murmured, passing the reins to her. "Keep the horses steady." He slipped from the wagon without a sound, melting into the shadows. Rebecca's heart hammered against her ribs. From the darkness, a voice called out in a language she didn't recognize, guttural and flowing. To her astonishment, Gabriel responded in the same tongue, his tone calm and respectful. 3 mounted figures emerged from the shadows. Starlight glinted off the rifle barrels they carried, but it was their proud bearing and distinctive dress that made Rebecca's breath catch. Blackfoot. The newspapers were filled with stories of raids and bloodshed. Gabriel continued speaking, gesturing occasionally toward the wagon. The leader of the warriors responded, his gaze flicking to Rebecca and the children. After a long exchange, Gabriel extended his hand, and the leader clasped his forearm in a gesture of respect. A few more words, and the warriors turned their horses, disappearing back into the darkness as silently as they had come. Gabriel returned to the wagon, stowing his rifle. "We can continue now." "Those were Blackfoot warriors," Rebecca said, unable to keep the tremor from her voice. "Yes." He clicked to the horses, setting them in motion again. "You speak their language. They respected you." He was silent for a long moment. "It's useful to speak with your neighbors. We have an understanding." His tone suggested the subject was closed. Rebecca settled back, her mind reeling. Gabriel Hayes was a man who negotiated with Blackfoot warriors in the dead of night. He ran a ranch on the edge of settled territory and offered sanctuary to the desperate. Her initial suspicion began to transform into a profound and unsettling curiosity. She had accepted this man's help out of necessity, but she was beginning to understand that she had stumbled into a world far more complex and perhaps more dangerous than the one she had fled. The first rays of dawn were painting the mountains in hues of rose and violet when they crested a final rise. Below them, nestled in a sheltered valley, lay Willow Creek Ranch. It was larger and more orderly than she had imagined, a collection of sturdy log buildings surrounded by fenced pastures and a winding cottonwood-lined stream. It looked like a place of peace, a fortress of tranquility against the harshness of the land. As they rolled into the yard, a tall black man with graying hair emerged from the barn, his movements careful and contained. A woman with dark braided hair and striking features stepped out of the house, a basket of eggs on her hip. "These are not workers," Gabriel said, correcting Rebecca's unspoken assumption. "They are residents. This is Isaiah, and this is Maria." Isaiah's welcome was a deep, cultured murmur, his intelligent eyes assessing her with cautious interest. Maria's was warmer, though her gaze was just as perceptive. "You must be exhausted," she said, her voice laced with a soft accent. "I have rooms prepared." Inside, the main house was spacious and clean, with a large stone fireplace, and to Rebecca's surprise, shelves lined with more books than she had ever seen in a private home. This was not the rustic cabin of a simple rancher. This was the home of an educated, thoughtful man. Maria showed her to a comfortable room, with an adjoining smaller room for the children. It was generous, far more than hired help could expect. Later, in the warm, bright kitchen, Rebecca met Maria's son Daniel, a quiet boy of 8 who shared her late husband's name, a coincidence that sent a sharp pang through her heart. As she sat with her children, forcing herself to eat the generous breakfast Maria had prepared, Gabriel entered. "I trust the accommodations are satisfactory," he said. "More than satisfactory," Rebecca replied carefully. "Far more than I expected." "Dignity matters," he said simply, as if it were the most obvious principle in the world. He then told her about the ranch, explaining that it sometimes served as a temporary sanctuary for those in need. "Sanctuary from what?" she asked. Gabriel studied her over his coffee cup. "From the world, Mrs. Mitchell. As you've recently discovered, it can be a hostile place." The comparison stung, but she could not deny its truth. She too had needed sanctuary. Over the next week, Rebecca began to understand the unique ecosystem of Willow Creek. Isaiah, she learned, was a former slave who had fought for the Union, a man of quiet dignity and deep sorrow. Maria had fled Mexico with her son after her husband was murdered by a corrupt landowner. They were all refugees knit together by shared trauma and the quiet strength of their protector Gabriel. And Gabriel himself remained an enigma. He was kind but reserved, his days spent working the ranch, his evenings spent reading in his study. He spoke little of his past, but Rebecca saw it in the haunted look that sometimes entered his eyes, and in the nightmares she occasionally heard through the thin walls of the house, choked off words of pain and regret from a war that was long over but clearly not forgotten. She found Daniel's hidden journal one afternoon while sorting through the trunk of his belongings. Tucked inside a worn copy of Shakespeare, it was a small leather-bound notebook filled with his precise, careful script. As she read, a cold dread settled in her stomach. Daniel hadn't just been organizing the workers. He had been meticulously documenting Bradley's crimes. Unsafe conditions, falsified reports, witness intimidation, and most damningly geological surveys that hinted at a massive, untapped silver vein on the North Ridge, a vein that extended directly under Gabriel Hayes's property. That evening, the first attack came. It wasn't a direct assault, but a creeping, insidious harassment. A section of fence was cut, allowing a dozen head of cattle to wander off. A few days later, the stream that watered the south pasture was found to be tainted, a dead animal deliberately thrown into it upstream. Gabriel's response was calm and methodical. "He's testing us," he said to Isaiah and Rebecca as they stood by the contaminated stream, "seeing how we react, pushing at the boundaries." Rebecca felt a surge of cold fury. This was Bradley's way, not direct confrontation, but the slow, grinding pressure of a bully. "We have to fight back." "We will," Gabriel said, his gaze meeting hers. "But not on his terms. We'll strengthen our defenses, but we won't be baited into a reckless response." He turned to her, his expression serious. "But you need to be prepared. If he escalates, things could get dangerous. I want to teach you how to use this." He handed her a small, well-balanced revolver. Over the next few days, in the quiet hours of the afternoon, Gabriel taught her to shoot. He was a patient instructor, his hands guiding hers, his voice a calm presence beside her. In those moments standing close, the air charged with the smell of gunpowder and the heat of the day, their bond deepened. It was more than the connection between an employer and an employee. It was the quiet understanding of two people, allied against a common, relentless foe. She learned to load, aim, and fire the weapon, becoming less a symbol of violence and more a tool of survival, a final defense for the home and family she had come to cherish. The attack came at dusk, without warning. A dozen of Bradley's men, led by a brutish foreman named Dawson, rode down on the ranch, their faces illuminated by the flickering torches they carried. They were not there to test the boundaries. They were there to erase them. The fight was a chaotic blur of sound and light, the crack of rifles, the splintering of wood, the terrified lowing of cattle. Isaiah and the ranch hands returned fire from the barn, and the corral, their positions well defended. Rebecca, her heart pounding, herded the children and Maria into the root cellar, its thick earthen walls a final sanctuary. Then, clutching the revolver Gabriel had given her, she took up a position at a small window in the main house, just as he had taught her. From her vantage point, she saw Gabriel moving through the chaos, not with the frantic energy of a cornered man, but with the deadly calm of a seasoned soldier. He directed the defense, his rifle speaking in sharp, precise bursts, forcing the attackers to keep their distance. Then a new figure appeared at the edge of the firelight, riding not with the hired thugs, but with an air of cold authority. It was Mason Bradley himself. He stayed back from the main fight, a corpulent spider watching from the edge of his web. But his eyes were fixed on one person, Gabriel. Hayes Bradley's voice, amplified by rage, cut through the din of the battle. "Show yourself. This is between you and me." Gabriel, taking cover behind a water trough, shouted back, "This was never about land, was it, Bradley? This is something else." A lull fell over the fight as Bradley urged his horse forward, stopping just outside the effective range of a pistol. The torchlight cast dancing demonic shadows across his face. "You're a clever man, Hayes. I'll grant you that. No, this was never just about a strip of dirt and a rumor of silver." He paused, his voice dropping to a low, venomous snarl that carried across the yard. "This is about my brother, Thomas Bradley. Does that name mean anything to you, Doctor?" Hayes. Rebecca froze the name, striking a chord deep in Gabriel's past. She saw him stiffen behind the trough. Antietam Bradley continued savoring each word. September 17th, 1862. The bloodiest day in this nation's history. You were a field surgeon for the Union. My brother Thomas was a private, barely 18. He was brought to your tent, a piece of shrapnel in his gut. He was lying on a cot, bleeding his life away. Gabriel said nothing, his silence a stark admission. And on the cot next to him, Bradley's voice rose to a fever pitch, was one of your pet savages, a Blackfoot scout, wounded but not dying, not like Thomas was. You had a choice, Doctor. A white boy from a good family, a soldier fighting for his country, or an Indian. And you chose the Indian. You operated on him while my brother bled to death not 5 feet away. The revelation hit Rebecca with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't about greed. It was a vendetta, a festering wound of grief and hatred that had poisoned Bradley for over 20 years. The mine, the land, the harassment, it was all an elaborate, cruel mechanism for destroying the man he blamed for his brother's death. Your brother's wound was mortal. Gabriel's voice was strained heavy with the weight of a memory he had clearly relived 1,000 times in his nightmares. There was nothing I could do for him. The scout, I could save him. A surgeon's duty is to save the life that can be saved. Duty. Bradley shrieked, his face contorted in a mask of pure hatred. Your duty was to your own kind. You let him die. I swore on his grave that I would find you and that I would take everything you ever built, everything you ever cared for, and grind it into the dust, just like you left my brother to die in the dirt. He raised a pistol, his hands shaking with rage, and fired wildly in Gabriel's direction. The shot went wide, but it broke the spell. The fighting erupted again, fiercer and more desperate than before. Bradley's men, fueled by their employer's raw fury, pressed their attack on the house. The attack was a wave of violence that crashed against the steadfast defenses of Willow Creek and then just as quickly receded. The attackers, having spent their initial fury and realizing the cost of a prolonged siege against determined defenders, pulled back into the darkness, leaving behind a wounded quiet. They had been repelled, but not defeated. A new, more ominous phase of the conflict had begun. Willow Creek was now an island, cut off from the outside world. Bradley's men controlled the road to Silver Creek, ensuring no supplies could get in and no messages could get out. Inside the main house, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and the low murmur of voices. Rebecca moved through the rooms, her hands steady as she tended to the wounded 2 ranch hands with minor flesh wounds. Gabriel was a quiet, efficient presence at her side, his past as a surgeon resurfacing as he cleaned and stitched with a skill that belied his calloused rancher's hands. "We can hold out for a week, maybe 2, Isaiah said, taking stock of their provisions. But after that our food stores will be low and our ammunition even lower." "He doesn't need to starve us out," Gabriel said grimly, tying off a bandage. "He just needs to keep us pinned down. He's proven his point that he can strike at will. Now he'll wait for us to break." Rebecca finished cleaning her instruments, her mind racing. They were trapped. The Federal Protection Order was a piece of paper miles away in a marshal's office. Here on the ground, Bradley's private army made the law. "We need proof," she said, the thought crystallizing with sudden urgency. "Not just testimony. We need definitive, undeniable proof of his crimes. Something that will force the authorities to act immediately, something even Bradley's influence can't suppress." She looked at Gabriel, her memory flashing back to the small leather-bound journal she had found among Daniel's things. "Daniel's notes," she said slowly. "He mentioned that Bradley kept a second ledger. A private one. He kept it locked in a safe in his office at the mine headquarters. It detailed all the bribes, the illegal land acquisitions, the falsified safety reports. It's the key to everything." Gabriel and Isaiah exchanged a look. "Getting into Silver Creek is one thing," Isaiah said. "Getting into Bradley's private office, a building that's guarded day and night, is another. He'll never expect it." Rebecca argued, her voice gaining strength. "He thinks we're trapped here waiting for his next move. He won't be expecting us to go on the offensive." "It's a desperate gamble," Gabriel said, though she could see the strategic possibility dawning in his eyes. "We're in a desperate situation," she countered. "We can't just wait here for him to burn us to the ground." She looked at him, her resolve hardening. "I can get us in. I know the town, the back alleys, the watch schedules. And I know the layout of the mine office. Daniel drew me a map of it once." A storm was gathering on the horizon, the sky to the west turning a bruised purple. The wind began to rise, whistling through the eaves of the house. The air grew heavy, charged with an electricity that mirrored the tension inside the room. "A storm," Gabriel observed, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. "It could provide cover." He turned back to her, a decision made. "It's too dangerous. I'll go alone." "No," Rebecca said firmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You don't know where to look. I do. We do this together, or we don't do it at all." For a long moment they stood in silent opposition, and the unsaid fears and feelings for each other hanging between them. Finally, he gave a single reluctant nod. "Together, then. We ride as soon as the storm hits." The thunderstorm broke over Silver Creek with the fury of a vengeful god. Rain fell in solid wind-driven sheets, turning the dusty streets into rivers of mud. Thunder cracked overhead, a deafening drum roll that shook the flimsy buildings, and flashes of lightning bleached the world in stark, momentary tableaus of white and black. Under the cover of this elemental chaos, 2 figures cloaked and hooded slipped through the back alleys of the town, moving like ghosts toward the hulking structure of the mine headquarters. Inside Bradley's opulent office, the storm was a muted roar. A single lamp cast a pool of golden light on a massive oak desk, illuminating papers, maps, and a half-empty glass of brandy. Gabriel worked on the safe, his surgeon's fingers surprisingly adept at manipulating the tumblers. Rebecca stood watch at the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass at the deserted street below. Every clap of thunder made her jump, her nerves stretched taut. Almost there, Gabriel murmured his focus absolute. With a final soft click, the heavy door of the safe swung open. Inside, nestled among stacks of currency and property deeds, was a large black ledger. Rebecca crossed the room as Gabriel lifted it out, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and dread. He placed it on the desk and opened it. The pages were filled with columns of names, dates, and figures, a meticulous record of Bradley's corruption. "This is it," she breathed, tracing a finger over a line item that read, S. Wyatt, monthly retainer. This will ruin him. As Gabriel scanned the pages, his eyes caught something else tucked into the back of the safe, a small oilskin-wrapped packet tied with a faded ribbon. He drew it out, his expression curious. Untying the ribbon, he unfolded the packet to reveal a small stack of letters. The handwriting was youthful, almost unformed. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. Gabriel's face was pale in the lamplight. "They're from Thomas," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "From Bradley's brother." He read the top letter aloud, his voice low and strained. It was a boy's letter from the front, filled with bravado and homesickness. But it was the last letter, dated the day before the Battle of Antietam, that made the world tilt on its axis. "Dearest Mason." Gabriel read, "I fear this may be my last letter. The fighting is terrible, worse than I can describe. If the worst should happen, I want you to know something. I met one of the surgeons, a Dr. Hayes. He is a good man, compassionate. He treats all the wounded, even the enemy, with the same care. There is a nobility in that Mason, a higher duty than flags or uniforms. Should I fall, do not seek vengeance in my name. Seek instead to live with the kind of honor I have witnessed in men like him." Gabriel fell silent, but there was one more piece of paper in the packet. It was not a letter, but a folded, blood-stained note. The handwriting was weak, barely legible. "It's a note from the field hospital's chief surgeon," Gabriel said, his voice thick with emotion. He read the terse, clinical lines. "Private Thomas Bradley. Mortal wound to the abdomen. Inoperable. Administered morphine for pain. Expired 16 to 30 hours. He looked up at Rebecca, his eyes filled with a terrible, dawning comprehension. He was already dying. There was never any choice to make. He then unfolded a second, smaller note tucked inside the first. The handwriting was Thomas's, shaky and faint. "Dr. Hayes." Gabriel read, his voice breaking. "Save the scout. My wound. It's done for me. Don't waste your skill. He has a family. Save him. Thank you for your kindness." The truth was a brutal, staggering revelation. Bradley's entire life, his decades-long crusade of hatred and vengeance, was built on a foundation of lies. Not Gabriel's lies, but his own. He had received these letters, this final note. He had known the truth all along. He had chosen to believe a fiction that allowed him to cultivate his hatred, to justify his cruelty. A floorboard creaked in the outer office. Gabriel looked up, his body instantly tensing. He shoved the ledger and the letters into a leather satchel as the office door swung open. Mason Bradley stood there, a revolver in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. Behind him stood Dawson and two other thugs. "I should have known," Bradley hissed, his eyes flicking from the open safe to the satchel in Gabriel's hand. The rat returns to the scene of the crime. It's over. Bradley Gabriel said, his voice devoid of heat, filled only with a profound, weary sadness. He held up Thomas's last shaky note. I know the truth, and so do you. You always have. For a fraction of a second, Bradley's composure shattered. A flicker of raw, unadulterated pain and the grief of a brother who had lied to himself for 20 years crossed his features. Then it was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure malevolence. Lies, he screamed, raising his pistol. All of it. You will not take this from me. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and light. Thunder crashed outside, perfectly timed with a roar of Bradley's revolver. The lamp on the desk shattered, plunging the room into near-total darkness, pierced only by the jagged, momentary flashes of lightning. Gabriel threw the heavy satchel at one of the thugs, knocking him off balance, and shoved Rebecca toward the floor behind the desk. Gunshots lit the darkness in strobing, terrifying bursts. Rebecca huddled on the floor, fired her own small revolver, in the direction of the muzzle flashes, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. A flash of lightning illuminated the scene. Dawson was down. One of the other thugs was clutching his arm. Gabriel was grappling with Bradley, the two men locked in a desperate struggle. It was not a gunfight of skilled marksmen, but a brutal close-quarters brawl fueled by decades of hatred and misunderstanding. Another flash of lightning. Gabriel had disarmed Bradley, but the larger man was using his bulk to crush him against the wall. Gabriel's face was contorted with effort. In that split second, Rebecca saw the remaining thug take aim at Gabriel's back. Without thinking, she raised her pistol and fired. The man grunted and collapsed. The fight between Gabriel and Bradley ended with a final desperate shove. Gabriel stumbled back. Bradley, free for a moment, lunged not for his fallen gun, but for the one thing he had left. With a roar of animalistic rage, he charged toward the large window overlooking the stormy street. Bradley, no, Gabriel yelled. But it was too late. With a final defiant scream, Mason Bradley crashed through the glass, his body swallowed by the storm and the darkness below. Silence descended on the room, broken only by the sound of the pouring rain and the ragged, gasping breaths of the living. A final distant clap of thunder rolled across the valley, a mournful echo of the violence that had just transpired. In the immediate aftermath, the world seemed to hold its breath. The storm began to subside, its fury spent, leaving behind a clean, rain-washed quiet. Gabriel helped Rebecca to her feet, his hands gentle on her arms, his face a grim silhouette in the pre-dawn light filtering through the shattered window. Below in the muddy street lay the still form of Mason Bradley. The long, bitter vendetta was finally over-ending, not in a blaze of glory, but in a desperate, self-inflicted fall. By sunrise, the town of Silver Creek began to stir its citizens, emerging to find their world irrevocably changed. The arrival of Marshal Prescott and a dozen deputies, summoned by a writer Isaiah, had dispatched hours earlier, solidified the new reality. They weren't arriving to save the day, but to deal with the consequences of a battle already won. They found the ledger, the letters, and the testimony of the surviving thugs, who were all too eager to betray their fallen master in exchange for leniency. The story of Bradley's decades-long deception and the truth of his brother's death spread through the town like wildfire. It was a tale of tragic, self-imposed delusion, a cautionary story that forced the community to reckon with its own complicity in Bradley's reign. In the days that followed, justice swift and decisive began to reshape Silver Creek. The mine was placed under federal receivership. James Turner, his integrity and experience recognized, was appointed the new mine foreman, immediately beginning to implement the safety measures Daniel had died fighting for. Sheriff Wyatt was arrested, his name prominent in Bradley's ledger, and a new honest lawman was appointed in his place. Gabrielle and Rebecca, their partnership forged in shared struggle, worked alongside the marshal, providing statements and helping to restore order. The town, free from the shadow of tyranny, began the slow process of healing. Weeks later, Judge Ezra Blackwood arrived from Helena. He did not come as a father, but as a federal judge overseeing the legal transition. Yet when he met with Gabriel at Willow Creek Ranch, the professional distance between them seemed to have narrowed. They spoke for hours in Gabriel's study, and when the judge emerged, the look he gave his son was one of profound, undeniable respect. He had seen the community Gabriel had built, the alliance with the Blackfoot, the loyalty of his people, and he finally understood. The wayward son had not been lost. He had found a different and perhaps more honorable path. Months passed. Autumn painted the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. The first snows dusted the high peaks of the mountains, promising a cold but peaceful winter. Willow Creek Ranch was thriving, a beacon of hope and resilience. The Turner family had settled in their laughter, joining the happy sounds of the other children. Isaiah taught a small class in the evenings for anyone who wished to learn to read, while Maria's garden produced a bounty that was shared with their neighbors. One crisp October afternoon, Rebecca walked alone to the small cemetery in Silver Creek. The town was quieter now, its rhythms slower and more humane. She stood before Daniel's grave, the simple wooden cross a familiar, comforting sight. The raw anguish of her grief had softened over time, replaced by a deep and abiding love and a quiet sense of peace. She knelt and took Daniel's wedding ring, which she had kept in a small pouch, from her pocket. She didn't place it on the grave, an act of finality. Instead, she gently pushed it into the soil at the base of the headstone, where it would become part of the earth he now rested in. It was not an act of forgetting, but of honoring. She was letting him rest, releasing him from the burden of her grief, just as she was releasing herself to live again. "I've found peace, Daniel," she whispered to the quiet stone. "The children are safe and happy. And I have found a new love, a good and honorable man. A man I think you would have been proud to call a friend." She stood, a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying lifted from her shoulders. With a final loving touch to the wooden cross, she turned and walked away, not looking back. She returned to Willow Creek as the sun was setting, casting long, golden shadows across the valley. Gabriel was waiting for her on the porch of the main house. He didn't speak, but the question was in his eyes. She walked up the steps and into his arms, resting her head against his chest. He held her close, his embrace a promise of strength and steadfastness. They stood together, watching as Emma and Joshua ran laughing across the yard, and their silhouettes dark against the vibrant tapestry of the sunset. This was their family, unconventional and forged in adversity, but whole and strong. This was their home, built not just of logs and stone, but of principle, courage, and love. They were not looking toward a wedding or grand declaration, but toward a quiet future stretching before them like the vast and beautiful Montana landscape, full of hardship. Yes, but also full of boundless possibility.